The red dust of Ouagadougou swirled around Captain Ibrahim Traoré's boots as he stood before his fallen comrade's grave. The acacia trees whispered secrets in the desert wind, their thorny branches casting shadows across the military cemetery. At 28, Ibrahim's eyes held the weight of a nation's suffering, each scar on his weathered hands telling stories of battles fought for Burkina Faso's soul. The mosque's call to prayer echoed across the compound, mixing with the distant sound of children playing in the streets beyond the barbed wire. His uniform, pressed despite the heat, bore the insignia of a man who had risen through merit, not privilege. The weight of his service pistol reminded him that some promises required more than words. "I swear on your grave, my brother," Ibrahim whispered in Moray, his voice barely audible above the rustling leaves. "This uniform will never bow to foreign masters again." The photograph in his calloused hands showed two young soldiers' arms around each other's shoulders, their smiles bright with hope before the French missions that claimed so many. His jaw clenched as he remembered the promises made by Western advisors, promises that turned to ash when his men needed them most. The golden hour light painted the cemetery in amber, but Ibrahim's heart burned with something fiercer than the Sahel sun. He folded the photograph carefully, placing it against his chest where his heart beat with revolutionary purpose. That evening, in the modest quarters he shared with fellow officers, Ibrahim opened his worn notebook under the flickering light of a single bulb. The pages were filled with his neat handwriting, strategies, observations, and dreams for a sovereign Burkina Faso. "Leadership is not about commanding," he wrote, "but about serving your people's dignity." Outside, the night market came alive with the sounds of commerce, women calling out prices for millet and fish, the rhythmic pounding of mortars, preparing evening meals. His pen moved across the page with the precision of a man who understood that ideas like bullets must find their mark. The young captain had no idea that this promise made in solitude and witnessed only by the stars would one day echo in the halls of international power. The morning sun cast long shadows across the military parade ground as Captain Traoré addressed his men for the first time as their new commander. His voice carried the authority of someone who had earned respect through shared hardship, not inherited privilege. The soldiers before him, young men from villages across Burkina Faso, stood straighter when he spoke of their sacred duty to protect their homeland. "We are not mercenaries for foreign interests," he declared, his words cutting through the desert air like a blade. The varicolour flag of Burkina Faso snapped in the wind above them, its red, white, and green stripes a reminder of the blood, peace, and hope their ancestors had fought to secure. Behind him, the imposing walls of the military compound seemed to pulse with new energy. In the months that followed, Ibrahim's reputation spread through the ranks like wildfire across the savannah. His late-night strategy sessions became legendary, where junior officers found themselves discussing not just military tactics, but the philosophical foundations of true leadership. A leader who cannot feed his people has no right to their loyalty. He would say, his finger-racing routes on dusty maps. The mess hall conversations grew more animated as soldiers shared stories of their commander's unconventional methods, how he visited their families, learned their tribal languages, and understood their struggles. His uniform remained simple, bearing only the insignia necessary for command, while his actions spoke louder than any decoration. The foreign advisors began to take notice, their reports back to their capitals growing increasingly concerned. The turning point came during a joint exercise with French forces when Ibrahim publicly questioned the mission parameters that put his men at unnecessary risk. The tension in the briefing room was palpable as he stood before the French colonel, his spine straight as a baobab tree. "With respect, sir, my soldiers are not expendable," he said in perfect French, his tone respectful but unwavering. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of helicopters returning from patrol. His men watched from the doorway, their pride evident in their posture as their commander defended their worth. That night, Ibrahim knew there was no turning back from the path he had chosen. Word by word, speech by speech, Ibrahim Traoré was transforming from a military officer into something far more dangerous to the established order, a true African leader. His evening prayers at the local mosque became community gatherings where elders shared their wisdom and young people found their voice. The market women began to speak his name with reverence, their conversations peppered with hopes for a different future. His simple quarters became a pilgrimage site for those seeking justice. The steady stream of visitors, a testament to his growing influence. The international community watched nervously as this young captain's vision began to crystallize into something that threatened their carefully constructed order. In the distance, the drums of change began to beat with increasing urgency. The presidential palace stood like a fortress against the azure sky as Captain Traoré led his men through its gilded halls for the first time as the nation's new leader. The portraits of former colonial administrators seemed to watch, with ghostly disapproval as his boots echoed on marble floors once reserved for foreign dignitaries. His first act was symbolic yet profound, removing the French flag from the presidential office and replacing it with the Pan-African colors that represented true independence. "Today we reclaim our sovereignty," he announced to his inner circle, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. The ornate furniture imported from Europe at great expense to the national treasury would soon be replaced with locally crafted pieces that celebrated Burkinabe artistry. Outside, the people of Ouagadougou had already begun to gather, sensing that history was being rewritten. Within his first 100 days, Ibrahim systematically dismantled the colonial apparatus that had strangled his nation for decades. The mining contracts that had enriched foreign corporations while leaving Burkinabe miners in poverty were torn up with ceremonial flourish. His economic advisors, many of them young scholars, educated in African universities rather than European institutions, worked tirelessly to redirect the nation's resources toward internal development. "Our gold belongs to our children," he declared during a nationally televised address, his words resonating in every village across the country. The international community's response was swift and predictable. Sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and thinly veiled threats. But Ibrahim had anticipated this reaction, his military background having taught him to prepare for inevitable counterattacks. The transformation extended beyond economics into the realm of cultural revival and national pride. French was no longer the mandatory language of government business, as Ibrahim insisted on conducting meetings in Mo and other indigenous languages. Traditional chiefs long marginalized by the colonial administrative system were invited to participate in governance, their ancient wisdom finally given the respect it deserved. The national curriculum was overhauled to teach African history from an African perspective, not through the distorted lens of colonial narratives. Young people began to wear traditional clothing with pride. Their ancestors' customs no longer viewed as backward, but as treasures to be preserved. The very air seemed to hum with newfound dignity as citizens walked taller, their heads held high for the first time in generations. Yet with each act of defiance, Ibrahim knew he was painting a target on his back that grew larger and more visible to those who profited from Africa's subjugation. The late-night security briefings grew more urgent as intelligence reports detailed the increasing international pressure building against his administration. His closest advisors urged caution, but Ibrahim's resolve only strengthened with each threat. His military training having taught him that retreat in the face of bullies only invited greater aggression. "They can arrest my body," he told his wife during one of their quiet evening conversations, "but they cannot arrest an idea whose time has come." The foundation he was building was stronger than any individual, rooted in the collective awakening of a people who had remembered their worth. As he signed each decree that further liberated his nation, Ibrahim Traoré knew that some battles were worth any personal cost. The United Nations General Assembly Hall fell silent as President Ibrahim Traoré approached the podium, his military bearing evident in every measured step. Representatives from 193 nations watched as this young African leader dressed in traditional Burkinabe cloth, rather than a Western suit, prepared to address the world's most powerful assembly. The ornate hall with its soaring ceiling and marble columns seemed to shrink around his commanding presence. His speech, written in his own hand during sleepless nights in Ouagadougou, contained words that would reverberate across continents. The translators adjusted their headsets, knowing they were about to witness history. Behind him, the flags of the world's nations hung motionless, as if even they were holding their breath. "Honorable delegates," Ibrahim began, his voice carrying the authority of centuries of African resistance, "I stand before you not as a beggar seeking aid, but as the representative of a sovereign people reclaiming their dignity. His words, "We do not seek your permission to be free," he declared, his gaze sweeping across the assembly. The delegates from the global south leaned forward in their seats, recognizing the voice of their collective aspirations. Social media exploded as his words were translated into dozens of languages shared millions of times within the first hour. The climax came when Ibrahim held up a contract, one of the exploitative mining agreements his government had terminated. "This document," he said, his voice rising with controlled passion, "represents the chains that have bound my people for generations disguised as development assistance." He tore the contract in half, the sound of ripping paper echoing through the hall like thunder. Several African delegates rose to their feet in spontaneous applause, their faces bright with pride and recognition. The Western delegates remained seated, their expressions ranging from shock to barely concealed anger. The image of that torn contract would become the symbol of a new African renaissance printed on T-shirts and murals from Lagos to Nairobi. As Ibrahim concluded his speech, the standing ovation from the African bloc was thunderous, joined by delegates from Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. "The age of begging is over," he declared, his final words hanging in the air like a battle cry. The hall erupted in a mixture of applause and uncomfortable shuffling as the implications of his message sank in. Outside, protesters who had gathered to support his message chanted his name, their voices carrying through the streets of Manhattan. That night, emergency meetings were held in the capitals of former colonial powers, their leaders grappling with the reality that the old order was crumbling. Ibrahim Traoré had not just given a speech, he had fired the first shot in a war for Africa's soul. The secure communication lines between Washington, Paris, and London hummed with urgent conversations as Ibrahim Traoré's influence spread across the continent like a wildfire. Intelligence briefings landed on presidential desks with alarming frequency, each report documenting another African leader inspired by Burkina Faso's example. The economic implications were staggering. If other nations followed Ibrahim's model, trillions in resource extraction profits would vanish overnight. Emergency NATO meetings convened behind closed doors, their participants speaking in hushed tones about the Traoré problem. The global financial markets began to fluctuate as investors realized that the predictable exploitation of African resources was no longer guaranteed. In boardrooms across Europe and America, corporate executives demanded immediate action from their government allies. The pressure campaign began subtly, with diplomatic channels working overtime to isolate Burkina Faso from international organizations. Ibrahim's government found itself excluded from key summits, their applications for development funding mysteriously delayed or rejected. The World Bank and IMF issued stern warnings about the dangerous precedent of unilateral contract cancellations. Western media outlets, once silent about African affairs, suddenly discovered an interest in reporting on instability in the region. The narrative was carefully crafted, portraying Ibrahim not as a liberation leader, but as a dangerous, radical, threatening regional peace. Social media algorithms were quietly adjusted to suppress positive coverage of his achievements while amplifying criticism from carefully selected sources. Military exercises increased dramatically along West African borders as peacekeeping forces positioned themselves for potential intervention. The USS Enterprise battle group was quietly redeployed to the Gulf of Guinea under the guise of combating piracy. French military bases in neighboring countries received additional personnel and equipment, their true purpose hidden behind humanitarian missions. Intelligence operatives moved through African capitals like shadows, offering incentives to opposition leaders and military commanders willing to act against Ibrahim's growing influence. The message was clear. The international community would not tolerate this challenge to the established order. Yet with each threatening move, Ibrahim's popularity among ordinary Africans only grew stronger. The final straw came when 3 more African nations announced their intention to follow Burkina Faso's example in renegotiating colonial-era contracts. Emergency sessions were called at the highest levels of government, where options ranging from economic sanctions to military intervention were discussed. With clinical detachment, the decision was made in a windowless room where men in expensive suits calculated the cost of African freedom against their quarterly profit margins. Ibrahim's fate was sealed not by his actions, but by the fear that his example would inspire others to demand the dignity that was rightfully theirs. The arrest warrant was prepared with bureaucratic efficiency, its legal language masking the raw desperation of a dying colonial system. As the international net tightened around him, Ibrahim continued his work, knowing that some battles are worth fighting regardless of the personal cost. The International Criminal Court's pristine offices in The Hague buzzed with unusual activity as the arrest warrant for President Ibrahim Traoré was finalized in the early hours of dawn. The document bearing official seals and signatures represented months of careful legal maneuvering designed to give legitimacy to what was essentially a political assassination. Chief Prosecutor Helena Vandenberg signed the warrant with a trembling hand, knowing that history would judge her role in this unprecedented action against a sitting African head of state. The charges read like a catalog of the very crimes committed by the colonial powers Ibrahim had challenged. Crimes against humanity, destabilization of regional peace, and economic terrorism. Outside her window, the peaceful Dutch countryside seemed oblivious to the international storm about to be unleashed. The warrant was immediately classified and distributed through secure channels to allied intelligence services worldwide. Within hours, the machinery of international law enforcement moved into action with mechanical precision. Interpol red notices were issued simultaneously across 6 continents, transforming Ibrahim from a head of state into a wanted fugitive in the span of a single morning. The timing was deliberately chosen during the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa, where Ibrahim was scheduled to deliver the keynote address on African unity. Ethiopian authorities, under intense pressure from their Western allies, reluctantly agreed to execute the warrant despite the diplomatic immunity traditionally accorded to visiting heads of state. The irony was not lost on African observers. The continent's own institutions were being used to arrest one of its most principled leaders. As news of the warrant leaked to international media, carefully orchestrated narratives began flooding news cycles across the globe. The arrest itself was conducted with theatrical precision, designed to humiliate rather than simply apprehend. Ibrahim was seized as he stepped from his aircraft onto Ethiopian soil, his security detail helplessly watching as international forces surrounded their leader. The images were broadcast worldwide, the young president in handcuffs, his dignified bearing intact despite the chains that bound him. His wife, watching from Ouagadougou, wept not for her husband's fate, but for the world that could not bear to see Africa stand tall. The symbolism was intentional and devastating. Africa's most vocal advocate for sovereignty reduced to a common criminal. Even his captors seemed uncomfortable with the weight of the moment, their eyes unable to meet his steady gaze. That evening, as Ibrahim sat in a holding cell designed for common criminals, he reflected on the path that had brought him to this moment. The concrete walls could not contain his spirit, nor could the charges against him diminish the truth of his cause. His last free act had been to sign an executive order transferring emergency powers to his vice president, ensuring that his government would continue even in his absence. The cell was sparse, a metal bed, a small sink, and a single barred window that looked out onto the gray Ethiopian sky. He had known this day would come, had prepared for it with the same methodical planning he had once applied to military campaigns. As he closed his eyes to pray, Ibrahim smiled slightly, knowing that his arrest had only validated everything he had fought to achieve. The transport aircraft's engines roared as Ibrahim Traoré was flown from Addis Ababa to The Hague, his wrists still bound by the same chains that had once held freedom fighters across Africa. Through the small window, he watched the continent of his birth disappear beneath the clouds, each mile taking him further from the soil he had sworn to protect. The other passengers, international marshals and legal officials, avoided his gaze, uncomfortable with the quiet dignity that radiated from their prisoner. His traditional Burkina robes, now wrinkled from the arrest, still bore the colors of his homeland's flag, a silent testament to the sovereignty he represented. The flight manifest listed him simply as Detainee 0001. But even in chains, Ibrahim carried himself with the bearing of a man who knew his cause was just. The irony was not lost on him. He was being transported to face justice by the very system that had ignored centuries of crimes against his people. Upon arrival at Scheveningen prison, Ibrahim's first night in solitary confinement was marked by an unexpected visitor. The prison chaplain, an elderly Dutch man named Father Johannes, entered the cell with obvious nervousness, expecting to find a broken man in need of spiritual comfort. Instead, he found Ibrahim kneeling in prayer, his voice softly reciting verses from the Quran in Arabic, before transitioning to traditional Mo prayers for his people. "I have come to offer you solace," the chaplain said hesitantly. But Ibrahim looked up with eyes that held no fear, only resolve. "Father," he replied with gentle respect, "I am exactly where I need to be." The chaplain left that night profoundly changed, later telling his colleagues that he had encountered not a criminal but a man of unshakable faith. The international media circus that surrounded his detention only grew more intense as images of Ibrahim in prison garb circulated globally. Yet something unexpected happened. The orange jumpsuit could not diminish his presence, and his first court appearance became a masterclass in dignified resistance. He stood before the international judges with his head held high, his voice steady, as he refused to enter a plea to charges he considered illegitimate. "I do not recognize the authority of this court to try a sovereign African leader for the crime of serving his people," he declared, his words echoing through the courtroom. The judges, accustomed to dealing with defendants desperate for mercy, found themselves unsettled by this man who showed no shame, only conviction. Social media exploded with images of Ibrahim in chains. But instead of seeing a defeated criminal, the world saw a leader who had sacrificed his freedom for his principles. Night after night in his cell, Ibrahim used his time to write, not appeals for clemency or protests of innocence, but letters to the youth of Africa. His words, smuggled out through sympathetic prison staff, became rallying cries for a generation that had found its voice through his example. "A man in chains who knows why he fights is freer than a man in a palace who has forgotten his purpose," he wrote, his pen moving across paper with the same precision he had once applied to military strategy. The guards, initially suspicious of his every move, gradually began to show him grudging respect, recognizing something in him that transcended their institutional roles. His cell became a place of pilgrimage for visitors, each one leaving with a deeper understanding of what true leadership meant. Even in captivity, Ibrahim Traoré was transforming everyone who encountered him, proving that dignity is not something that can be taken away. It can only be surrendered. The International Criminal Court's main courtroom filled to capacity as President Ibrahim Traoré's trial began, the weight of global attention pressing down on every participant like a physical force. The mahogany paneled chamber designed to project authority and impartiality seemed to shrink around Ibrahim's commanding presence as he entered, wearing the simple white robes he had requested instead of standard court attire. His legal team, composed of brilliant African jurists who had volunteered their services, flanked him with quiet pride, their faces reflecting the historic nature of this moment. The prosecution table overflowed with documents and laptops, a technological army arrayed against a man who carried only his convictions. Judge Patricia Morrison, presiding over her most controversial case, struggled to maintain judicial neutrality as she felt the eyes of history upon her. The gallery buzzed with whispered conversations in a dozen languages, diplomats and journalists documenting every gesture, every word. The prosecution's opening statement painted Ibrahim as a dangerous radical who had destabilized international law through his reckless actions against legitimate business interests. Lead prosecutor James Whitfield's voice echoed through the chamber as he described the chaos that had resulted from Ibrahim's policies, carefully omitting any mention of the prosperity and dignity these same policies had brought to ordinary Burkinabe citizens. The PowerPoint presentation that followed was a masterpiece of selective information showing graphs of declined foreign investment while ignoring the surge in local development and education. Ibrahim listened with the patience of a man who had expected exactly this performance, his eyes never leaving the prosecutor's face. His defense team took careful notes, but Ibrahim himself seemed almost serene, as if he were watching a play in which he was merely an interested observer. The international media, expecting to see a desperate man fighting for his freedom, instead witnessed something far more unsettling, a leader who seemed genuinely untroubled by the charges against him. When Ibrahim finally rose to address the court, the transformation was immediate and electric. His voice, trained in military command but tempered by years of serving his people, filled every corner of the chamber without amplification. "Honorable judges," he began, his words carrying the weight of centuries of African resistance. "You ask me to defend actions that need no defense, to justify the self-evident right of a people to determine their own destiny." He spoke without notes, his hands gesturing naturally as he dismantled the prosecution's arguments with surgical precision. The court reporters struggled to keep pace as he quoted international law, African philosophy, and the testimonies of his own people with equal fluency. Even the prosecution team found themselves leaning forward, caught up in the intellectual force of his presentation, despite their professional antagonism. The climax came when Ibrahim turned to face the gallery, his gaze encompassing the African diplomats, the international observers, and the journalists who would carry his words to the world. "I stand before you guilty of one crime only," he declared, his voice rising with controlled passion. "The crime of believing that African children deserve the same dignity, the same opportunities, the same respect as children born in any other continent." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of cameras clicking and the rustle of note-taking. Several African diplomats wiped away tears while others sat transfixed by the moral authority emanating from the dock. As Ibrahim returned to his seat, even his guards seemed different, their posture subtly shifted by exposure to something greater than the institutional roles they had been trained to perform. The courtroom had become a classroom, and everyone present had just received an education in the true meaning of leadership. The courtroom fell into stunned silence as General Marcus Thompson, the Pentagon's most decorated African affairs strategist, entered through the witness door with measured military precision. His dress uniform, adorned with ribbons representing 3 decades of service across multiple continents, seemed to command respect from every corner of the chamber. The prosecution had called him as their star witness, expecting him to testify about the security threats posed by Ibrahim's policies to regional stability. Instead, the general's steel-gray eyes found Ibrahim's across the courtroom, and something unspoken passed between the two military men. The media representatives leaned forward in their seats, sensing that the carefully orchestrated proceedings were about to take an unexpected turn. Judge Morrison adjusted her glasses, her judicial instincts warning her that the next few minutes would define not just this trial, but her own legacy. General Thompson, the prosecutor, began confidently. "Please tell the court how President Traoré's actions have destabilized the security architecture of West Africa." The general stood at attention, his weathered face betraying no emotion as he surveyed the packed courtroom. "I have read President Traoré's military files," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had commanded respect on battlefields across the world. "I have studied his tactical innovations, his leadership under fire, and his unwavering commitment to his soldiers' welfare." The prosecutor's confident expression began to falter as the general's testimony took an unexpected direction. "What I found was not a destabilizing force, but a leader who embodies the highest ideals of military service." The African diplomats in the gallery exchanged glances, hardly daring to believe what they were hearing from a senior American military official. The moment that would be remembered for generations came when General Thompson turned to face Ibrahim directly, his military bearing evident in every line of his body. "President Traoré," he said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "I have served my country for 32 years, and I have never enca narrative was irreparable. If America's most senior military expert on African affairs could salute the defendant, what did that say about the charges themselves?" The general's testimony continued for another hour, methodically dismantling every accusation with the precision of a man who had spent his career distinguishing between genuine threats and manufactured crisis. Social media exploded with images of the salute, the moment becoming a symbol of respect transcending political boundaries. As General Thompson left the courtroom, he paused at the defense table, leaning down to whisper something in Ibrahim's ear that made the African leader smile for the first time since his arrest. The trial would continue, but everyone present knew that the general's salute had already delivered the only verdict that mattered. The International Criminal Court's final verdict came not through the judge's deliberation, but through the thunderous applause that erupted when General Thompson's salute became the defining image of the trial. Within hours, the footage had been viewed over 1 billion times, sparking demonstrations in every African capital and forcing even the most reluctant international observers to acknowledge the moral authority of the man they had tried to silence. The prosecution's case crumbled like a house built on sand, their carefully constructed narrative unable to withstand the weight of authentic respect from one of their own star witnesses. Judge Morrison, recognizing the shifting tide of global opinion, quietly dismissed the charges on procedural grounds, allowing the court to save face while freeing Ibrahim without admitting their error. The courtroom that had witnessed his humiliation now became the stage for his vindication. As supporters from across the world gathered to celebrate not just his freedom, but the principles he represented. The chains that had bound him became symbols of resistance displayed in museums across Africa as reminders of the price of dignity. Ibrahim's first act upon release was not to seek revenge or demand apologies, but to kneel and kiss the tarmac of the airport in Ouagadougou, his tears mixing with the red dust of his homeland. The crowd that greeted him numbered in the hundreds of thousands, their voices raised in songs that had sustained African resistance for generations. His wife Mariam stood waiting with their children, her face radiant with pride rather than relief, for she had never doubted that justice would ultimately prevail. The traditional drums that had once called warriors to battle now celebrated the return of a leader who had proven that moral courage could triumph over institutional power. International media crews, initially skeptical of the spectacle, found themselves documenting something unprecedented: a people's genuine love for a leader who had sacrificed everything for their dignity. The red carpet rolled out for his arrival was woven by local artisans, its patterns telling the story of a nation that had rediscovered its worth. The ripple effects of Ibrahim's trial and vindication spread across Africa with the speed of lightning, inspiring a generation of young leaders to reject the compromises that had defined their predecessors. Universities across the continent established the Traoré doctrine as a field of study, examining how principled leadership could challenge seemingly insurmountable odds. The mining contracts that had been torn up in his famous UN speech remained null and void, their legal challenges failing in courts that could no longer ignore the moral implications of colonial exploitation. General Thompson's salute became the symbol of a new era in international relations, where respect was earned through character rather than commanded through force. The small cell in Chiang prison, where Ibrahim had spent his darkest hours, was transformed into a monument to the power of unwavering conviction. His letters to African youth, smuggled out during his imprisonment, became a manifesto for continental liberation that inspired movements from Cape Town to Cairo. Years later, historians would mark Ibrahim Traoré's arrest and trial as the moment when Africa's psychological independence finally caught up with its political independence. The young captain who had once knelt by his comrade's grave had become the embodiment of his continent's dignity, his personal sacrifice transforming him into a symbol larger than any individual. The promise he had made in solitude, witnessed only by the stars and the whispers of ancient trees, had grown into a movement that no force on earth could contain. Schools across Africa taught his story to children who would never know the shame of colonial subjugation, their textbooks filled with images of the general salute and the moment when respect transcended all boundaries. The uniform that had once marked him as a soldier now resided in the